Selected Works of Mao Zedong, Volume 2, Audiobook, Part 8. Problems of Strategy in Guerrilla War Against Japan, May 1938. In the early days of the War of Resistance against Japan, many people inside and outside the party belittled the important strategic role of guerrilla warfare and pinned their hopes on regular warfare alone, and particularly on the operations of the Kuomintang forces. Comrade Mao Zedong refuted this view and wrote this article to show the correct road of development for anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare. As a result, the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, which had just over 40,000 men when the War of Resistance began in 1937, grew to a great army of 1 million by the time Japan surrendered in 1945, established many revolutionary base areas, played a great part in the war, and thus throughout this period made Chiang Kai-shek afraid to capitulate to Japan or launch a nationwide civil war. In 1946, when Chiang Kai-shek did launch a nationwide civil war, the People's Liberation Army, formed out of the 8th Route and new 4th Armies, was strong enough to deal with his attacks. Chapter 1. Why raise the question of strategy in guerrilla war? In the War of Resistance against Japan, regular warfare is primary and guerrilla warfare supplementary. This point has already been correctly settled. Thus, it seems there are only tactical problems in guerrilla warfare. Why then raise the question of strategy? If China were a small country in which the role of guerrilla warfare was only to render direct support over short distances to the campaigns of the regular army, there would of course be only tactical problems, but no strategic ones. On the other hand, if China were a country as strong as the Soviet Union, and the invading enemy could either be quickly expelled, or even though his expulsion were to take some time, he could not occupy extensive areas, then again, guerrilla warfare would simply play a supporting role in campaigns, and would naturally involve only tactical but not strategic problems. The question of strategy in guerrilla war does arise, however, in the case of China, which is neither small nor like the Soviet Union, but which is both a large and a weak country. This large and weak country is being attacked by a small and strong country, but the large and weak country is in an era of progress. This is the source of the whole problem. It is in these circumstances that vast areas have come under enemy occupation, and that the war has become a protracted one. The enemy is occupying vast areas of this large country of ours, but Japan is a small country. She does not have sufficient soldiers, and has to leave many gaps in the occupied areas, so that our anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare consists primarily not in interior line operations in support of the campaigns of the regular troops, but in independent operations on exterior lines. Furthermore, China is progressive, that is to say, she has a staunch army and broad masses of people, both led by the Communist Party, so that far from being small-scale, our anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare is in fact large-scale warfare. Hence, the emergence of a whole series of problems such as the strategic defensive, the strategic offensive, etc. The protracted nature of the war and its attendant ruthlessness have made it imperative for guerrilla warfare to undertake many unusual tasks, hence such problems as those of the base areas, the development of guerrilla warfare into mobile warfare, and so on. For all these reasons, China's guerrilla warfare against Japan has broken out of the bounds of tactics to knock at the gates of strategy, and it demands examination from the viewpoint of strategy. The point that merits our particular attention is that such extensive as well as protracted guerrilla warfare is quite new in the entire history of war. This is bound up with the fact that we are now in the 1930s and 1940s, and that we now have the Communist Party and the Red Army. Herein lies the heart of the matter. Our enemy is probably still cherishing fond dreams of emulating the Mongol conquest of the Song dynasty. the Manchu conquest of the Ming Dynasty, the British occupation of North America and India, the Latin occupation of Central and South America, etc. But such dreams have no practical value in present-day China because there are certain factors present in the China of today which were absent in those historical instances. And one of them is guerrilla warfare, which is quite a new phenomenon. If our enemy overlooks this fact, he will certainly come to grief. These are the reasons why our anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare, though occupying only a supplementary place in the war of resistance as a whole, must nevertheless be examined from the viewpoint of strategy. Why not then apply to guerrilla warfare the general strategic principles of the war of resistance? The question of strategy in our anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare is indeed closely linked with the question of strategy in the war of resistance as a whole because they have much in common. On the other hand, guerrilla warfare is different from regular warfare and has its own peculiarities, and consequently many peculiar elements are involved in the question of strategy in guerrilla warfare. Without modification, it is impossible to apply the strategic principles of the war of resistance in general to guerrilla warfare with its own peculiarities. Chapter 2. The basic principle of war is to preserve oneself and destroy the enemy. Before discussing the question of strategy in guerrilla warfare in concrete terms, a few words are needed on the fundamental problem of war. All the guiding principles of military operations grow out of the one basic principle, to strive to the utmost to preserve one's own strength and destroy that of the enemy. In a revolutionary war, this principle is directly linked with basic political principles. For instance, the basic political principle of China's war of resistance against Japan, i.e., its political aim, is to drive out Japanese imperialism and to build an independent, free, and happy new China. In terms of military action, this principle means the use of armed force to defend our motherland and to drive out the Japanese invaders. To attain this end, the operations of the armed units take the form of doing their utmost to preserve their own strength, on the one hand, and destroy the enemies, on the other. How, then, do we justify the encouragement of heroic sacrifice in war? Every war exacts a price, sometimes an extremely high one. Is this not in contradiction with preserving oneself? In fact, there is no contradiction at all. To put it more exactly, sacrifice and self-preservation are both opposite and complementary to each other, for such sacrifice is essential not only for destroying the enemy but also for preserving oneself. Partial and temporary non-preservation, sacrifice, or paying the price, is necessary for the sake of general and permanent preservation. From this basic principle stems the series of principles guiding military operations, all of which, from the principles of shooting, taking cover to preserve oneself and making full use of firepower to destroy the enemy, to the principles of strategy, are permeated with the spirit of this basic principle. All technical, tactical, and strategic principles represent applications of this basic principle. The principle of preserving oneself and destroying the enemy is the basis of all military principles. Chapter 3. 6 Specific Problems of Strategy in Guerrilla War against Japan. Now let us see what policies or principles have to be adopted in guerrilla operations against Japan before we can attain the object of preserving ourselves and destroying the enemy. Since the guerrilla units in the War of Resistance and in all other revolutionary wars generally grow out of nothing and expand from a small to a large force, they must preserve themselves and, moreover, they must expand. Hence, the question is, what policies or principles have to be adopted before we can attain the object of preserving and expanding ourselves and destroying the enemy? Generally speaking, the main principles are as follows. 1. The use of initiative, flexibility, and planning in conducting offensive within the defensive, battles of quick decision within protracted war, and exterior line operations within interior line operations. 2. Coordination with regular warfare. 3. Establishment of base areas. 4. The strategic defensive and the strategic offensive. 5. The development of guerrilla warfare into mobile warfare. And 6. Correct relationship of command. These 6 items constitute the whole of the strategic program for guerrilla war against Japan and are the means necessary for the preservation and expansion of our forces. for the destruction and expulsion of the enemy, for coordination with regular warfare, and the winning of final victory. Chapter 4. Initiative, flexibility, and planning in conducting offensive within the defensive, battles of quick decision within protracted war, and exterior line operations within interior line operations. Here the subject may be dealt with under 4 headings. 1. The relationship between the defensive and the offensive, between protractedness and quick decision, and between the interior and exterior lines. 2. The initiative in all operations. 3. Flexible employment of forces. And 4. Planning in all operations. To start with the first. If we take the War of Resistance as a whole, the fact that Japan is a strong country and is attacking, while China is a weak country and is defending herself, makes our war strategically a defensive and protracted war. As far as the operational lines are concerned, the Japanese are operating on exterior and we on interior lines. This is one aspect of the situation. But there is another aspect, which is just the reverse. The enemy forces, though strong, in arms, in certain qualities of their men, and certain other factors, are numerically small, whereas our forces, though weak, likewise in arms, in certain qualities of our men, and certain other factors, are numerically very large. Added to the fact that the enemy is an alien nation invading our country, while we are resisting his invasion on our own soil, this determines the following strategy. It is possible and necessary to use tactical offensives within the strategic defensive to fight campaigns and battles of quick decision within a strategically protracted war, and to fight campaigns and battles on exterior lines within strategically interior lines. Such is the strategy to be adopted in the War of Resistance as a whole. It holds true both for regular and for guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is different only in degree and form. Offensives in guerrilla warfare generally take the form of surprise attacks. Although surprise attacks can and should be employed in regular warfare too, the degree of surprise is less. In guerrilla warfare, the need to bring operations to a quick decision is very great, and our exterior line ring of encirclement of the enemy in campaigns and battles is very small. All these distinguish it from regular warfare. Thus, it can be seen that in their operations, guerrilla units have to concentrate the maximum forces, act secretly and swiftly, attack the enemy by surprise, and bring battles to a quick decision, and that they must strictly avoid passive defense, procrastination, and the dispersal of forces before engagements. Of course, guerrilla warfare includes not only the strategic but also the tactical defensive. The latter embraces, among other things, containing and outpost actions during battles, the disposition of forces for resistance at narrow passes, strategic points, rivers or villages, in order to deplete and exhaust the enemy, and action to cover withdrawal. But the basic principle of guerrilla warfare must be the offensive, and guerrilla warfare is more offensive in its character than regular warfare. The offensive, moreover, must take the form of surprise attacks, and to expose ourselves by ostentatiously parading our forces is even less permissible in guerrilla warfare than in regular warfare. From the fact that the enemy is strong and we are weak, it necessarily follows that in guerrilla operations in general, even more than in regular warfare, battles must be decided quickly, though on some occasions guerrilla fighting may be kept up for several days, as in an assault on a small and isolated enemy force cut off from help. Because of its dispersed character, guerrilla warfare can spread everywhere, and in many of its tasks, as in harassing, containing, and disrupting the enemy, and in mass work, its principle is dispersal of forces. But a guerrilla unit or a guerrilla formation must concentrate its main forces when it is engaged in destroying the enemy, and especially when it is striving to smash an enemy attack. Concentrate a big force to strike at a small section of the enemy force remains a principle of field operations in guerrilla warfare. Thus it can also be seen that if we take the War of Resistance as a whole, we can attain the aim of our strategic defensive and finally defeat Japanese imperialism only through the cumulative effect of many offensive campaigns and battles in both regular and guerrilla warfare, namely through the cumulative effect of many victories and offensive actions. only through the cumulative effect of many campaigns and battles of quick decision, namely, the cumulative effect of many victories achieved through quick decision in offensive campaigns and battles, can we attain our goal of strategic protractedness, which means gaining time to increase our capacity to resist, while hastening or awaiting changes in the international situation and the internal collapse of the enemy, in order to be able to launch a strategic counteroffensive and drive the Japanese invaders out of China. We must concentrate superior forces and fight exterior line operations in every campaign or battle, whether in the stage of strategic defensive or in that of strategic counteroffensive, in order to encircle and destroy the enemy forces, encircling part if not all of them, destroying part if not all of the forces we have encircled, and inflicting heavy casualties on the encircled forces if we cannot capture them in large numbers. Only through the cumulative effect of many such battles of annihilation can we change the relative position as between the enemy and ourselves, thoroughly smash his strategic encirclement, that is, his scheme of exterior line operations, and finally, in coordination with international forces and the revolutionary struggles of the Japanese people, surround the Japanese imperialists and deal them the coup de grace. These results are to be achieved mainly through regular warfare, with guerrilla warfare making a secondary contribution. What is common to both, however, is the accumulation of many minor victories to make a major victory. Herein lies the great strategic role of guerrilla warfare in the war of resistance. Now let us discuss initiative, flexibility, and planning in guerrilla warfare. What is initiative in guerrilla warfare? In any war, the opponents contend for the initiative, whether on a battlefield, in a battle area, in a war zone, or in the whole war, for the initiative means freedom of action for an army. Any army which, losing the initiative, is forced into a passive position and ceases to have freedom of action faces the danger of defeat or extermination. Naturally, gaining the initiative is harder in strategic defensive and interior line operations, and easier in offensive exterior line operations. However, Japanese imperialism has two basic weaknesses, namely its shortage of troops and the fact that it is fighting on foreign soil. Moreover, its underestimation of China's strength and the internal contradictions among the Japanese militarists have given rise to many mistakes in command, such as piecemeal reinforcement, lack of strategic coordination, occasional absence of a main direction for attack, failure to grasp opportunities in some operations, and failure to wipe out encircled forces, all of which may be considered the third weakness of Japanese imperialism. Thus, despite the advantage of being on the offensive and operating on exterior lines, the Japanese militarists are gradually losing the initiative because of their shortage of troops, their small territory, small population, inadequate resources, feudalistic imperialism, etc. Because of the fact that they are fighting on foreign soil, their war is imperialist and barbarous, and because of their stupidities in command. Japan is neither willing nor able to conclude the war at present, nor has her strategic offensive yet come to an end, but as the general trend shows, her offensive is confined within certain limits, which is the inevitable consequence of her three weaknesses. She cannot go on indefinitely till she swallows the whole of China. Already there are signs that Japan will one day find herself in an utterly passive position. China, on the other hand, was in a rather passive position at the beginning of the war, but having gained experience, she is now turning to the new policy of mobile warfare, the policy of taking the offensive, seeking quick decisions, and operating on exterior lines in campaigns and battles, which, together with the policy of developing widespread guerrilla warfare, is helping China to build up a position of initiative day by day. The question of the initiative is even more vital in guerrilla warfare, for most guerrilla units operate in very difficult circumstances, fighting without a rear, with their own weak forces facing the enemy's strong forces, lacking experience when the units are newly organized, being separated, etc. Nevertheless, it is possible to build up the initiative in guerrilla warfare, the essential condition being to seize on the enemy's three weaknesses. Taking advantage of the enemy's shortage of troops from the viewpoint of the war as a whole, the guerrilla units can boldly use vast areas as their field of operation. Taking advantage of the fact that the enemy is an alien invader and is pursuing a most barbarous policy, the guerrilla units can boldly enlist the support of millions upon millions of people, and taking advantage of the stupidities in the enemy's command, the guerrilla units can give full scope to their resourcefulness, while the regular army must seize on all these weaknesses of the enemy and turn them to good account in order to defeat him. It is even more important for the guerrilla units to do so. As for the guerrilla units' own weaknesses, they can be gradually reduced in the course of the struggle. Moreover, these weaknesses sometimes constitute the very condition for gaining the initiative. For example, it is precisely because the guerrilla units are small that they can mysteriously appear and disappear in their operations behind enemy lines, without the enemies being able to do anything about them, and thus enjoy a freedom of action such as massive regular armies never can. When the enemy is making a conversion attack from several directions, a guerrilla unit can exercise initiative only with difficulty and can lose it all too easily. In such a case, if its appraisals and dispositions are wrong, it is liable to get into a passive position and consequently fail to smash the converging enemy attack. This may occur even when the enemy is on the defensive and we are on the offensive, for the initiative results from making a correct appraisal of the situation, both our own and that of the enemy, and from making the correct military and political dispositions. A pessimistic appraisal, out of accord with the objective conditions and the passive dispositions ensuing from it, will undoubtedly result in the loss of the initiative and throw one into a passive position. On the other hand, an over-optimistic appraisal, out of accord with the objective conditions and the risky, unjustifiably risky dispositions ensuing from it, will also result in the loss of the initiative and eventually land one in a position similar to that of the pessimists. The initiative is not an innate attribute of genius, but is something an intelligent leader attains through open-minded study and correct appraisal of the objective conditions, and through correct military and political dispositions. It follows that the initiative is not ready-made, but is something that requires conscious effort. When forced into a passive position through some incorrect appraisal and disposition, or through overwhelming pressure, a guerrilla unit must strive to extricate itself. How this can be done depends on the circumstances. In many cases, it is necessary to move away. The ability to move is the distinctive feature of a guerrilla unit. To move away is the principal method for getting out of a passive position and regaining the initiative, but it is not the sole method. The moment when the enemy is most energetic and we are in the greatest difficulties is often the very moment when things begin to turn against him and in our favor. Frequently, a favorable situation recurs and the initiative is regained as a result of holding out a little longer. Next, let us deal with flexibility. Flexibility is a concrete expression of the initiative. The flexible employment of forces is more essential in guerrilla warfare than in regular warfare. A guerrilla commander must understand that the flexible employment of his forces is the most important means of changing the situation as between the enemy and ourselves and of gaining the initiative. The nature of guerrilla warfare is such that guerrilla forces must be employed flexibly in accordance with the task in hand, and with such circumstances as the state of the enemy, the terrain, and the local population, and the chief ways of employing the forces are dispersal, concentration, and shifting of position. In employing his forces, a guerrilla commander is like a fisherman casting his net, which he should be able to spread wide, as well as draw in tight. When casting his net, the fisherman has to ascertain the depth of the water, the speed of the current, and the presence or absence of obstructions. Similarly, when dispersing his units, a guerrilla commander must take care not to incur losses through ignorance of the situation or through miscalculated action. Just as the fisherman must keep a grip on the cord in order to draw his net in tight, so the guerrilla commander must maintain liaison and communication with all his forces and keep enough of his main forces at hand. Just as a frequent change of position is necessary in fishing, so a frequent shift of position is necessary for a guerrilla unit. Dispersal, concentration, and shifting of position are the three ways of flexibly employing forces in guerrilla warfare. Generally speaking, the dispersal of guerrilla units, or breaking up the whole into parts, is employed chiefly 1. When we want to threaten the enemy with a wide frontal attack because he is on the defensive and there is temporarily no chance to mass our forces for action. 2. When we want to harass and disrupt the enemy throughout an area where his forces are weak. 3. When we are unable to break through the enemy's encirclement and try to slip away by making ourselves less conspicuous. 4. When we are restricted by terrain or supplies. Or 5. When we are carrying on mass work over a wide area. But whatever the circumstances, when dispersing for action, we should pay attention to the following. 1. We should never make an absolutely even dispersal of forces, but should keep a fairly large part in an area convenient for maneuver, so that any possible exigency can be met, and there is a center of gravity for the task being carried out in dispersion. And 2. We should assign to the dispersed units clearly defined tasks, fields of operation, time limits for action, places for reassembly, and ways and means of liaison. Concentration of forces, or assembling the parts into a whole, is the method usually applied to destroy an enemy when he is on the offensive, and sometimes to destroy some of his stationary forces when he is on the defensive. Concentration of forces does not mean absolute concentration, but the massing of the main forces for use in one important direction, while retaining or dispatching part of the forces for use in other directions to contain, harass, or disrupt the enemy, or to carry on mass work. Although the flexible dispersal or concentration of forces according to circumstances is the principal method in guerrilla warfare, we must also know how to shift or transfer our forces flexibly. When the enemy feels seriously threatened by guerrillas, he will send troops to attack or suppress them. Hence, the guerrilla units will have to take stock of the situation. If advisable, they should fight where they are. If not, they should lose no time in shifting elsewhere. Sometimes, in order to crush the enemy units one by one, guerrilla units which have destroyed an enemy force in one place may immediately shift to another so as to wipe out a second enemy force. Sometimes, finding it inadvisable to fight in one place, they may have to disengage quickly and fight the enemy elsewhere. If the enemy's forces in a certain place present a particularly serious threat, the guerrilla units should not linger, but should move off with lightning speed. In general, shifts of position should be made with secrecy and speed. In order to mislead, decoy, and confuse the enemy, they should constantly use stratagems, such as making a feint to the east but attacking in the west, appearing now in the south and now in the north, hidden run attacks, and night actions. Flexibility in dispersal, concentration, and shifts of position is a concrete expression of the initiative in guerrilla warfare, whereas rigidness and inertia inevitably lead to passivity and cause unnecessary losses. But a commander proves himself wise not just by recognition of the importance of employing his forces flexibly, but by skill in dispersing, concentrating, or shifting them in good time according to the specific circumstances. This wisdom in sensing changes and choosing the right moment to act is not easily acquired. It can be gained only by those who study with a receptive mind and investigate and ponder diligently. Prudent consideration of the circumstances is essential to prevent flexibility from turning into impulsive action. Lastly, we come to planning. Without planning, victories in guerrilla warfare are impossible. Any idea that guerrilla warfare can be conducted in haphazard fashion indicates either a flippant attitude or ignorance of guerrilla warfare, the operations in a guerrilla zone as a whole, or those of a guerrilla unit or formation, must be preceded by as thorough planning as possible, by preparation in advance for every action, grasping the situation, setting the tasks, disposing the forces, giving military and political training, securing supplies, putting the equipment in good order, making proper use of the people's help, etc. All these are part of the work of the guerrilla commanders, which they must carefully consider and conscientiously perform and check up on. There can be no initiative, no flexibility, and no offensive unless they do so. True, guerrilla conditions do not allow as high a degree of planning as do those of regular warfare, and it would be a mistake to attempt very thorough planning in guerrilla warfare, but it is necessary to plan as thoroughly as the objective conditions permit, for it should be understood that fighting the enemy is no joke. The above points serve to explain the first of the strategic principles of guerrilla warfare, the principle of using initiative, flexibility, and planning in conducting offensive within the defensive, battles of quick decision within protracted war, and exterior line operations within interior line operations. It is the key problem in the strategy of guerrilla warfare. The solution of this problem provides the major guarantee of victory in guerrilla warfare so far as military command is concerned. Although a variety of matters have been dealt with here, they all revolve around the offensive in campaigns and battles. The initiative can be decisively grasped only after victory in an offensive. Every offensive operation must be organized on our initiative and not launched under compulsion. Flexibility in the employment of forces revolves around the effort to take the offensive, and planning likewise is necessarily, chiefly, in order to ensure success in offensive operations. Measures of tactical defense are meaningless if they are divorced from their role of giving either direct or indirect support to an offensive. Quick decision refers to the tempo of an offensive, and exterior lines refer to its scope. The offensive is the only means of destroying the enemy and is also the principal means of self-preservation, while pure defense and retreat can play only a temporary and partial role in self-preservation and are quite useless for destroying the enemy. The principle stated above is basically the same for both regular and guerrilla war. It differs to some degree only in its form of expression. But in guerrilla war, it is both important and necessary to note this difference. It is precisely this difference in form which distinguishes the operational methods of guerrilla war from those of regular war. If we confuse the two different forms in which the principle is expressed, victory in guerrilla war will be impossible. Chapter 5. Coordination with regular warfare. The second problem of strategy in guerrilla warfare is its coordination with regular warfare. It is a matter of clarifying the relation between guerrilla and regular warfare on the operational level in the light of the nature of actual guerrilla operations. An understanding of this relation is very important for effectiveness in defeating the enemy. There are three kinds of coordination between guerrilla and regular warfare: coordination in strategy, in campaigns, and in battles. Taken as a whole, guerrilla warfare behind the enemy lines, which cripples the enemy, pins him down, disrupts his supply lines, and inspires the regular forces and the people throughout the country, is coordinated with regular warfare in strategy. Take the case of the guerrilla warfare in the three northeastern provinces. Of course, the question of coordination did not arise before the nationwide war of resistance, but since the war began, the significance of such coordination has become obvious. Every enemy soldier the guerrillas kill there, every bullet they make the enemy expend, every enemy soldier they stop from advancing south of the Great Wall can be reckoned a contribution to the total strength of the resistance. It is, moreover, clear that they are having a demoralizing effect on the whole enemy army and all Japan, and a heartening effect on our whole army and people. Still clearer is the role in strategic coordination played by the guerrilla warfare along the Peiping Suyuan, Peiping Hankao, Tientsin Pukao, Tatung Puchao, Chengting Taiyuan, and Shanghai Hangzhou railways. Not only are the guerrilla units performing the function of coordination with the regular forces in our present strategic defensive, when the enemy is on this strategic offensive, not only will they coordinate with the regular forces in disrupting the enemy's hold on the occupied territory after he concludes his strategic offensive and switches to the safeguarding of his gains, they will also coordinate with the regular forces in driving out the enemy forces and recovering all the lost territories when the regular forces launch the strategic counteroffensive. The great role of guerrilla warfare in strategic coordination must not be overlooked. The commanders both of the guerrilla units and of the regular forces must clearly understand this role. In addition, guerrilla warfare performs the function of coordination with regular warfare in campaigns. For instance, in the campaigns at Shinkou, north of Taiyuan, the guerrillas played a remarkable role in coordination both north and south of Yanmenquan by wrecking the Tatung Puchao Railway and the motor roads running through Pingxingquan and Yangfangkou. Or, take another instance. After the enemy occupied Fenglin-2, guerrilla warfare, which was already widespread throughout Shansi province and was conducted mainly by the regular forces, played an even greater role through coordination with defensive campaigns west of the Yellow River in Shansi province and south of the Yellow River in Honan province. Again, when the enemy attacked southern Shantung, the guerrilla warfare in the 5 provinces of northern China contributed a great deal through coordination with the campaigns of our army. In performing a task of this sort, the leaders of each guerrilla base behind the enemy lines or the commanders of a guerrilla formation temporarily dispatched there must dispose their forces well, and by adopting different tactics suited to the time and place, move energetically against the enemy's most vital and vulnerable spots in order to cripple him, pin him down, disrupt his supply lines, inspire our armies campaigning on the interior lines, and so fulfill their duty of coordinating with the campaign. If each guerrilla zone or unit goes it alone without giving any attention to coordinating with the campaigns of the regular forces, its role in strategic coordination will lose a great deal of its significance, although it will still play some such role in the general strategy. All guerrilla commanders should give this point serious attention. To achieve coordination in campaigns, it is absolutely necessary for all larger guerrilla units and guerrilla formations to have radio equipment. Finally, coordination with the regular forces in battle and actual fighting on the battlefield is the task of all guerrilla units in the vicinity of an interior line battlefield. Of course, this applies only to guerrilla units operating close to the regular forces or to units of regulars dispatched on temporary guerrilla missions. In such cases, a guerrilla unit has to perform whatever task it is assigned by the commander of the regular forces, which is usually to pin down some of the enemy's forces, disrupt his supply lines, conduct reconnaissance, or act as guides for the regular forces. Even without such an assignment, the guerrilla unit should carry out these tasks on its own initiative. To sit by idly, neither moving nor fighting, or to move about without fighting, would be an intolerable attitude for a guerrilla unit. Chapter 6. The Establishment of Base Areas. The third problem of strategy in anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare is the establishment of base areas, which is important and essential because of the protracted nature and ruthlessness of the war. The recovery of our lost territories will have to await the nationwide strategic counter-offensive. By then, the enemy's front will have extended deep into central China and cut it in two from north to south, and a part or even a greater part of our territory will have fallen into the hands of the enemy and become his rear. We shall have to extend guerrilla warfare all over this vast enemy-occupied area, make a front out of the enemy's rear, and force him to fight ceaselessly throughout the territory he occupies, until such time as our strategic counteroffensive is launched, and so long as our lost territories are not recovered, it will be necessary to persist in guerrilla warfare in the enemy's rear. Certainly for a fairly long time, though one cannot say definitely how long. This is why the war will be a protracted one, and, in order to safeguard his gains in the occupied areas, the enemy is bound to step up his anti-guerrilla measures, and especially after the halting of his strategic offensive, to embark on relentless suppression of the guerrillas. With ruthlessness thus added to protractedness, it will be impossible to sustain guerrilla warfare behind the enemy lines without base areas. What then are these base areas? They are the strategic bases on which the guerrilla forces rely in performing their strategic tasks and achieving the object of preserving and expanding themselves, and destroying and driving out the enemy. Without such strategic bases, there will be nothing to depend on in carrying out any of our strategic tasks, or achieving the aim of the war. It is a characteristic of guerrilla warfare behind the enemy lines that it is fought without a rear, for the guerrilla forces are severed from the country's general rear. But guerrilla warfare could not last long or grow without base areas. The base areas, indeed, are its rear. History knows many peasant wars of the roving rebel type, but none of them ever succeeded. In the present age of advanced communications and technology, it would be all the more groundless to imagine that one can win victory by fighting in the manner of roving rebels. However, this roving rebel idea still exists among impoverished peasants, and in the minds of guerrilla commanders, it becomes the view that base areas are neither necessary nor important. Therefore, ridding the minds of guerrilla commanders of this idea is a prerequisite for deciding on a policy of establishing base areas. The question of whether or not to have base areas, and of whether or not to regard them as important, in other words, the conflict between the idea of establishing base areas and that of fighting like roving rebels, arises in all guerrilla warfare, and, to a certain extent, our anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare is no exception. Therefore, the struggle against the roving rebel ideology is an inevitable process. Only when this ideology is thoroughly overcome, and the policy of establishing base areas is initiated and applied, will there be conditions favorable for the maintenance of guerrilla warfare over a long period. Now that the necessity and importance of base areas have been made clear, let us pass on to the following problems which must be understood and solved when it comes to establishing the base areas. These problems are the types of base areas, the guerrilla zones and the base areas, the conditions for establishing base areas, their consolidation and expansion, and the forms in which we and the enemy encircle one another. The types of base areas. Base areas in anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare are mainly of three types: those in the mountains, those on the plains, and those in the river-lake estuary regions. The advantage of setting up base areas in mountainous regions is obvious, and those which have been, are being, or will be established in the Changpai, Wutai, Taihang, Taishan, Yinshan, and Maoshan mountains all belong to this type. Footnote 1. The Changpai mountain range is situated on the northeastern border of China. After the Japanese invasion on September 18, 1931, the region became a base area for the anti-Japanese guerrillas led by the Chinese Communist Party. Into footnote 1. Footnote 2. The Wutai mountain range is situated on the borders between Shansi, Hopei, and what was then Charhar Province. In October 1937, the 8th Route Army, led by the Chinese Communist Party, started building the Shansi, Charhar, Hopei anti-Japanese base area, with the Wutai mountain region as its center. Into footnote 2. Footnote 3. The Taihang mountain range is situated on the borders between Shansi, Hopei, and Honan provinces. In November 1937, the 8th Route Army started building the southeastern Shansi anti-Japanese base area, with the Taihang mountain region as its center. Into footnote 3. Footnote 4. The Taishan Mountain is one of the chief peaks of the Taiyi mountain range in central Shantung. In the winter of 1937, the guerrilla forces led by the Communist Party started building the central Shantung anti-Japanese base area with the Taiyi mountain region as its center. Into footnote 4. Footnote 5. The Yinshan mountain range is situated on the border of Hopei and what was then Jehol province. In the summer of 1938, the 8th Route Army started building the eastern Hopei anti-Japanese base area with the Yinshan mountain region as its center. Into footnote 5. Footnote 6. The Maoshan mountains are in southern Jiangsu. In June 1938, the new 4th Army, led by the Communist Party, started building the southern Jiangsu anti-Japanese base area with the Maoshan mountain region as its center. End of footnote 6. Returning to the main text. They are all places where anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare can be maintained for the longest time and are important strongholds for the war of resistance. We must develop guerrilla warfare and set up base areas in all the mountainous regions behind the enemy lines. Of course, the plains are less suitable than the mountains, but it is by no means impossible to develop guerrilla warfare or establish any base areas there. Indeed, the widespread guerrilla warfare in the plains of Hopei and of northern and northwestern Shantung proves that it is possible to develop guerrilla warfare in the plains. While there is as yet no evidence on the possibility of setting up base areas there and maintaining them for long, it has been proved that the setting up of temporary base areas is possible, and it should be possible to set up base areas for small units or for seasonal use. On the one hand, the enemy does not have enough troops at his disposal and is pursuing a policy of unparalleled brutality, and on the other hand, China has a vast territory and vast numbers of people who are resisting Japan. The objective conditions for spreading guerrilla warfare and setting up temporary base areas in the plains are therefore fulfilled. Given competent military command, it should of course be possible to establish bases for small guerrilla units there, bases which are long-term but not fixed. Footnote 7. Experience gained in the War of Resistance proved that it was possible to establish long-term and in many places stable base areas in the plains. This was due to their vastness and big populations, the correctness of the Communist Party's policies, the extensive mobilization of the people, and the enemy's shortage of troops. Comrade Mao Zedong affirmed this possibility more definitely in later directives. End of footnote 7. Broadly speaking, when the strategic offensive of the enemy is brought to a halt and he enters the stage of safeguarding his occupied areas, he will undoubtedly launch savage attacks on all the guerrilla base areas, and those in the plains will naturally be the first to bear the brunt. The large guerrilla formations operating on the plains will be unable to keep on fighting there for long, and will gradually have to move up into the mountains, as the circumstances require, as for instance, from the Hopei Plain to the Wutai and Taihang Mountains, or from the Shantung Plain to Taishan Mountain and the Shantung Peninsula in the east. But, in the circumstances of our national war, it is not impossible for numerous small guerrilla units to keep going in various countries over the vast plains and adopt a fluid way of fighting, i.e., by shifting their bases from place to place. It is definitely possible to conduct seasonal guerrilla warfare by taking advantage of the green curtain of tall crops in summer and of the frozen rivers in winter. As the enemy has no strength to spare now, and will never be able to attend to everything even when he has the strength to spare, it is absolutely necessary for us to decide on the policy for the present of spreading guerrilla warfare far and wide, and setting up temporary base areas in the plains, and for the future of preparing to keep up guerrilla warfare by small units, if only seasonally, and of creating base areas, which are not fixed. Objectively speaking, the possibilities of developing guerrilla warfare and establishing base areas are greater in the river-lake estuary regions than in the plains, though less than in the mountains. The dramatic battles fought by pirates and water bandits of which our history is full, and the guerrilla warfare round the Honghu Lake, kept up for several years in the Red Army period, both testified to the possibility of developing guerrilla warfare and of establishing base areas in the river-lake estuary regions. So far, however, the political parties and the masses who are resisting Japan have given this possibility little attention. Though the subjective conditions are as yet lacking, we should undoubtedly turn our attention to this possibility and start working on it. As one aspect in the development of our nationwide guerrilla warfare, we should effectively organize guerrilla warfare in the Hangtse Lake region north of the Yangtze River, in the Taihu Lake region south of the Yangtze, and in all river-lake estuary regions in the enemy-occupied areas, along the rivers and on the seacoast, and we should create permanent base areas in and near such places. By overlooking this aspect, we are virtually providing the enemy with water transport facilities. This is a gap in our strategic plan for the War of Resistance, which must be filled in good time. Guerrilla zones and base areas. In guerrilla warfare behind the enemy lines, there is a difference between guerrilla zones and base areas. Areas which are surrounded by the enemy, but whose central parts are not occupied or have been recovered, like some counties in the Wutai Mountain region, i.e., the Shanse Charhar Hopei border area, and also some places in the Taihang and Taishan Mountain regions, are ready-made bases for the convenient use of guerrilla units in developing guerrilla warfare. But elsewhere in these areas, the situation is different, as for instance in the eastern and northern sections of the Wutai Mountain region, which include parts of western Hopei and southern Charhar, and in many places east of Paoting and west of Shengchao. When guerrilla warfare began, the guerrillas could not completely occupy these places but could only make frequent raids. They are areas which are held by the guerrillas when they are there, and by the puppet regime when they are gone and are therefore not yet guerrilla bases but only what may be called guerrilla zones. Such guerrilla zones will be transformed into base areas when they have gone through the necessary processes of guerrilla warfare, that is, when large numbers of enemy troops have been annihilated or defeated there, the puppet regime has been destroyed, the masses have been roused to activity, anti-Japanese mass organizations have been formed, people's local armed forces have been developed, and anti-Japanese political power has been established. By the expansion of our base areas, we mean the addition of areas, such as these, to the bases already established. In some places, for example, Eastern Hopei, the whole area of guerrilla operations has been a guerrilla zone from the very beginning. The puppet regime is of long standing there, and from the beginning the whole area of operations has been a guerrilla zone, both for the people's armed forces that have grown out of local uprisings, and for the guerrilla detachments dispatched from the Wutai Mountains. At the outset of their activities, all they could do was to choose some fairly good spots there as temporary rear or base areas. Such places will not be transformed from guerrilla zones into relatively stable base areas until the enemy's forces are destroyed and the work of arousing the people is in full swing. Thus, the transformation of a guerrilla zone into a base area is an arduous creative process, and its accomplishment depends on the extent to which the enemy is destroyed and the masses are aroused. Many regions will remain guerrilla zones for a long time. In these regions, the enemy will not be able to set up stable puppet regimes however much he tries to maintain control, while we on our part will not be able to achieve the aim of establishing anti-Japanese political power however much we develop guerrilla warfare. Examples of this kind are to be found in the enemy-occupied regions along the railway lines, in the neighborhood of big cities, and in certain areas in the plains. As for the big cities, the railway stops, and the areas in the plains, which are strongly garrisoned by the enemy, guerrilla warfare can only extend to the fringes and not right into these places which have relatively stable puppet regimes. This is another kind of situation. Mistakes in our leadership or strong enemy pressure may cause a reversal of the state of affairs described above, i.e., a guerrilla base may turn into a guerrilla zone, and a guerrilla zone may turn into an area under relatively stable enemy occupation. Such changes are possible, and they deserve special vigilance on the part of guerrilla commanders. Therefore, as a result of guerrilla warfare and the struggle between us and the entire enemy-occupied territory will fall into the following three categories. First, anti-Japanese bases held by our guerrilla units and our organs of political power. Second, areas held by Japanese imperialism and its puppet regimes. And third, intermediate zones, contested by both sides, namely guerrilla zones. Guerrilla commanders have the duty to expand the first and third categories to the maximum and to reduce the second category to the minimum. This is the strategic task of guerrilla warfare. Conditions for establishing base areas. The fundamental conditions for establishing a base area are that there should be anti-Japanese armed forces, that these armed forces should be employed to inflict defeats on the enemy, and that they should arouse the people to action. Thus, the establishment of a base area is first and foremost a matter of building an armed force. Leaders in guerrilla war must devote their energy to building one or more guerrilla units, and must gradually develop them in the course of struggle into guerrilla formations, or even into units and formations of regular troops. The building up of an armed force is the key to establishing a base area. If there is no armed force, or if the armed force is weak, nothing can be done. This constitutes the first condition. The second indispensable condition for establishing a base area is that the armed forces should be used in coordination with the people to defeat the enemy. All places under enemy control are enemy and not guerrilla base areas, and obviously cannot be transformed into guerrilla base areas unless the enemy is defeated. Unless we repulse the enemy's attacks and defeat him, even places held by the guerrillas will come under enemy control, and then it will be impossible to establish base areas. The third indispensable condition for establishing a base area is the use of all our strength, including our armed forces, to arouse the masses for struggle against Japan. In the course of this struggle, we must arm the people, i.e., organize self-defense corps and guerrilla units. In the course of this struggle, we must form mass organizations. We must organize the workers, peasants, youth, women, children, merchants, and professional people according to the degree of their political consciousness and fighting enthusiasm into the various mass organizations necessary for the struggle against Japanese aggression, and we must gradually expand them. Without organization, the people cannot give effect to their anti-Japanese strength. In the course of this struggle, we must weed out the open and the hidden traitors, a task which can be accomplished only by relying on the strength of the people. In this struggle, it is particularly important to arouse the people to establish or to consolidate their local organs of anti-Japanese political power. Where the original Chinese organs of political power have not been destroyed by the enemy, we must reorganize and strengthen them with the support of the broad masses, and where they have been destroyed by the enemy, we should rebuild them by the efforts of the masses. They are organs of political power for carrying out the policy of the anti-Japanese National United Front, and should unite all the forces of the people to fight against our sole enemy, Japanese imperialism and its jackals, the traitors and reactionaries. A base area for guerrilla war can be truly established only with the gradual fulfillment of the three basic conditions, i.e., only after the anti-Japanese armed forces are built up, the enemy has suffered defeats, and the people are aroused. Mention must also be made of geographical and economic conditions. As for the former, we have already discussed 3 different categories in the earlier section on the types of base areas, and here we need only mention one major requirement, namely, that the area must be extensive. In places surrounded by the enemy on all sides, or on 3 sides, the mountainous regions naturally offer the best conditions for setting up base areas which can hold out for a long time, but the main thing is that there must be enough room for the guerrillas to maneuver, namely, the areas have to be extensive. Given an extensive area, guerrilla warfare can be developed and sustained even in the plains, not to mention the river-lake estuary regions. By and large, the vastness of China's territory and the enemy's shortage of troops provide guerrilla warfare in China with this condition. This is an important, even a primary condition, as far as the possibility of waging guerrilla warfare is concerned, and small countries like Belgium, which lack this condition, have few or no such possibilities. Footnote 8. Ever since the end of World War II, the national and democratic revolutionary movement has been surging forward in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In many countries, the people, led by their own revolutionary and progressive forces, have carried on sustained armed struggles to overthrow the dark rule of imperialism and reaction. This demonstrates that in the new historical circumstances, when the socialist camp, the revolutionary forces of the people in the colonial countries, and the forces of the people striving for democracy and progress in all countries are taking giant strides forward, when the world capitalist system is weakening still further, and when the colonial rule of imperialism is heading for disintegration, the conditions under which the people of various countries conduct guerrilla warfare today need not be quite the same as those which were necessary in the days of the guerrilla warfare waged by the Chinese people against Japan. In other words, guerrilla war can be victoriously waged in a country which is not large in territory, as for instance, in Cuba, Algeria, Laos, and southern Vietnam. End of footnote 8. In China, this condition is not something which has to be striven for, nor does it present a problem. It is there physically, waiting only to be exploited. So far as their physical setting is concerned, the economic conditions resemble the geographical conditions. For now, we are discussing the establishment of base areas not in a desert, where no enemy is to be found, but behind the enemy lines. Every place the enemy can penetrate already has its Chinese inhabitants and an economic basis for subsistence, so that the question of choice of economic conditions in establishing base areas simply does not arise. Irrespective of the economic conditions, we should do our utmost to develop guerrilla warfare and to set up permanent or temporary base areas in all places where Chinese inhabitants and enemy forces are to be found. In a political sense, however, the economic conditions do present a problem of economic policy, which is of immense importance to the establishment of base areas. The economic policy of the guerrilla base areas must follow the principles of the anti-Japanese National United Front, by equitably distributing the financial burden and protecting commerce. Neither the local organs of political power nor the guerrilla units must violate these principles, or otherwise the establishment of base areas and the maintenance of guerrilla warfare would be adversely affected. The equitable distribution of the financial burden means that those with money should contribute money, while the peasants should supply the guerrilla units with grain within certain limits. The protection of commerce means that the guerrilla units should be highly disciplined and that the confiscation of shops, except those owned by private traders, should be strictly prohibited. This is no easy matter, but the policy is set and must be put into effect. The consolidation and expansion of base areas. In order to confine the enemy invaders to a few strongholds, that is, to the big cities and along the main communication lines, the guerrillas must do all they can to extend guerrilla warfare from their base areas as widely as possible and hem in all the enemy's strongholds, thus threatening his existence and shaking his morale while expanding the base areas. This is essential. In this context, we must oppose conservatism in guerrilla warfare, whether originating in the desire for an easy life or in overestimation of the enemy's strength. Conservatism can only bring losses in the war of resistance and is harmful to guerrilla warfare and to the base areas themselves. At the same time, we must not forget the consolidation of the base areas, the chief task being to arouse and organize the masses and to train guerrilla units and local armed forces. Such consolidation is needed for maintaining protracted warfare and also for expansion, and in its absence, energetic expansion is impossible. If we attend only to expansion and forget about consolidation in our guerrilla warfare, we shall be unable to withstand the enemy's attacks, and consequently not only forfeit the possibility of expansion, but also endanger the very existence of the base areas. The correct principle is expansion with consolidation, which is a good method and allows us to take the offensive or the defensive as we choose. Given a protracted war, the problem of consolidating and expanding base areas constantly arises for every guerrilla unit. The concrete solution depends, of course, on the circumstances. At one time, the emphasis may be on expansion, i.e., on expanding the guerrilla zones and increasing the number of guerrillas. At another, the emphasis may be on consolidation, i.e., on organizing the masses and training the troops. As expansion and consolidation differ in nature, and as the military dispositions and other tasks will differ accordingly, an effective solution of the problem is possible only if we alternate the emphasis according to time and circumstances. Forms in which we and the enemy encircle one another. Taking the war of resistance as a whole, there is no doubt that we are strategically encircled by the enemy, because he is on the strategic offensive and is operated on exterior lines, while we are on the strategic defensive and are operating on interior lines. This is the first form of enemy encirclement. We, on our part, encircle each of the enemy columns, advancing on us along separate routes, because we apply the policy of the offensive and of exterior line operations in campaigns and battles by using numerically preponderant forces against these enemy columns advancing on us from exterior lines. This is the first form of our encirclement of the enemy. Next, if we consider the guerrilla base areas in the enemy's rear, each area taken singly is surrounded by the enemy on all sides, like the Taishan Mountain region, or on three sides, like the northwestern Shansi area. This is the second form of enemy encirclement. However, if one considers all the guerrilla base areas together, and in their relation to the battlefronts of the regular forces, one can see that we in turn surround a great many enemy forces. In Shansi province, for instance, we have surrounded the Tatung-Puchao Railway on three sides, the east and west flanks, and the southern end, and the city of Taiyuan on all sides. And there are many similar instances in Hopei and Shantung provinces. This is the second form of our encirclement of the enemy. Thus, there are two forms of encirclement by the enemy forces and two forms of encirclement by our own, rather like a game of Wei Chi. Footnote 9. Wei Chi is an old Chinese game in which the two players try to encircle each other's pieces on the board. When a player's pieces are encircled, they are counted as dead, captured. But if there is a sufficient number of blank spaces among the encircled pieces, then the latter are still alive, not captured. End of footnote 9. Campaigns and battles fought by the two sides resemble the capturing of each other's pieces, and the establishment of strongholds by the enemy, and of guerrilla base areas by us, resembles moves to dominate spaces on the board. It is in the matter of dominating the spaces that the great strategic role of guerrilla base areas in the rear of the enemy is revealed. We are raising this question in the War of Resistance, in order that the nation's military authorities and the guerrilla commanders in all areas should place on the agenda the development of guerrilla warfare behind the enemy lines and the establishment of base areas wherever possible, and carry this out as a strategic task. If on the international plane we can create an anti-Japanese front in the Pacific region, with China as one strategic unit, and the Soviet Union and other countries which may join it as other strategic units, we shall then have one more form of encirclement against the enemy than he has against us, and bring about exterior line operations in the Pacific region by which to encircle and destroy fascist Japan. To be sure, this is of little practical significance at present, but such a prospect is not impossible. Chapter 7. The Strategic Defensive and the Strategic Offensive in Guerrilla War. The fourth problem of strategy in guerrilla war concerns the strategic defensive and the strategic offensive. This is the problem of how the policy of offensive warfare, which we mentioned in our discussion of the first problem, is to be carried out in practice when we are on the defensive and when we are on the offensive in our guerrilla war against Japan. Within the nationwide strategic defensive or strategic offensive, to be more exact, the strategic counteroffensive, small-scale strategic defensives and offensives take place in and around each guerrilla base area. By strategic defensive, we mean our strategic situation and policy when the enemy is on the offensive and when we are on the defensive. By strategic offensive, we mean our strategic situation and policy when the enemy is on the defensive and we are on the offensive. The strategic defensive in guerrilla war. After guerrilla warfare has broken out and grown to a considerable extent, the enemy will inevitably attack the guerrilla base areas, especially in the period when his strategic offensive against the country as a whole is brought to an end and he adopts the policy of safeguarding his occupied areas. It is essential to recognize the inevitability of such attacks, for otherwise the guerrilla commanders will be caught wholly unprepared, and in the face of heavy enemy attacks they will undoubtedly become alarmed and confused, and their forces will be routed. To wipe out the guerrillas and their base areas, the enemy frequently resorts to conversion attacks. For instance, in each of the 4 or 5 punitive expeditions directed against the Taishan Mountain region, the enemy made a planned advance in 3 or 4 or even 6 or 7 columns simultaneously. The larger the scale of the guerrilla fighting, the more important the position of the base areas and the greater the threat to the enemy's strategic centers and vital communication lines, the fiercer will be the enemy's attacks. Therefore, the fiercer the enemy's attacks on a guerrilla area, the greater the indication that the guerrilla warfare there is successful and is being effectively coordinated with the regular fighting. When the enemy launches a conversion attack in several columns, the guerrilla policy should be to smash it by counterattack. It can be easily smashed if each advancing enemy column consists of only one unit, whether big or small, has no follow-up units, and is unable to station troops along the route of advance, construct blockhouses, or build motor roads. When the enemy launches a converging attack, he is on the offensive and operating on exterior lines, while we are on the defensive and operating on interior lines. As for our dispositions, we should use our secondary forces to pin down several enemy columns, while our main force should launch surprise attacks, chiefly in the form of ambushes, in a campaign or battle against a single enemy column, striking it when it is on the move. The enemy, though strong, will be weakened by repeated surprise attacks and will often withdraw when he is halfway. The guerrilla units can then make more surprise attacks during the pursuit and weaken him still further. The enemy generally occupies the county towns or other towns in our base areas before he stops his offensive or begins to withdraw, and we should encircle these towns, cutting off his grain supply and severing his communications, so that when he cannot hold out and begins to retreat, we can seize the opportunity to pursue and attack him. After smashing one column, we should shift our forces to smash another, and by smashing them one by one, shatter the converging attack. A big base area like the Taishan Mountain region forms a military area, which is divided into 4 or 5 or even more military sub-areas, each with its own armed forces operating independently. By employing the tactics described above, these forces have often smashed the enemy's attacks simultaneously or successively. In our plan of operations against a conversion attack by the enemy, we generally place our main force on interior lines, but when we have the strength to spare, we should use our secondary forces, such as the county or the district guerrilla units, or even detachments of the main force on exterior lines to disrupt the enemy's communications and pin down his reinforcements. Should the enemy stay put in our base area, we may reverse the tactics, namely leave some of our forces in the base area to invest the enemy while employing the main force to attack the region whence he has come and to step up our activities there. In order to induce him to withdraw and attack our main force, this is the tactic of relieving the state of Chao by besieging the state of Wei. Footnote 10. In 353 BC, the state of Wei laid siege to Hantan, capital of the state of Chao. The king of the state of Che, an ally of Chao, ordered his generals Tian Che and Sun Pin to aid Chao with their troops. Knowing that the crack forces of Wei had entered Chao and left their own territory weakly garrisoned, General Sun Pin attacked the state of Wei, whose troops withdrew to defend their own country. Taking advantage of their exhaustion, the troops of Che engaged and routed them at Guiling, northeast of the present Hotsu County in Shantung. The siege of Hantan, capital of Chao, was thus lifted. Since then, Chinese strategists have referred to similar tactics as relieving the state of Chao by besieging the state of Wei. End of footnote 10. In the course of operations against a conversion attack, the local anti-Japanese self-defense corps and all the mass organizations should mobilize for action and in every way help our troops to fight the enemy. In fighting the enemy, it is important both to enforce local martial law and, as far as possible, to strengthen our defense works and clear the fields. The purpose of the former is to suppress traitors and prevent the enemy from getting information, and of the latter to assist our own operations by strengthening our defense works, and prevent the enemy from getting food by clearing the fields. Clearing the fields means harvesting the crops as soon as they are ripe. When the enemy retreats, he often burns down the houses in the cities and towns he has occupied, and razes the village along his route, with the purpose of destroying the guerrilla base areas, but in so doing he deprives himself of shelter and food in his next offensive, and the damage recoils upon his own head. This is a concrete illustration of what we mean by one and the same thing having two contradictory aspects. A guerrilla commander should not think of abandoning his base area and shifting to another unless it proves impossible after repeated operations to smash the enemy's heavy converging attacks. In these circumstances, he must guard against pessimism. So long as the leaders do not blunder in matters of principle, it is generally possible to smash the converging attacks and hold on to the base areas in the mountainous regions. It is only in the plains that, when confronted by a heavy converging attack, the guerrilla commander should consider other measures in light of these specific circumstances, namely, leaving many small units for scattered operations while temporarily shifting large guerrilla formations to some mountainous region so that they can return and resume their activities in the plains once the main forces of the enemy move away. Generally speaking, the Japanese cannot adopt the principle of blockhouse warfare which the Kuomintang employed in the days of the Civil War because their forces are inadequate in relation to China's vast territory. However, we should reckon with the possibility that they may use it to some extent against those guerrilla base areas which pose a particular threat to their vital positions, but even in such circumstances we should be prepared to keep up guerrilla warfare in those areas. Since we have had the experience of being able to maintain guerrilla warfare during the Civil War, there is not the slightest doubt of our greater capacity to do so in a national war, though, in point of relative military strength, the enemy can throw forces that are vastly superior in quantity as well as in quality against some of our base areas. There remain the insoluble national contradiction between us and the enemy and the unavoidable weaknesses of his command. Our victories are based on thorough work among the masses and flexible tactics in our operations. The strategic offensive in guerrilla war. After we have smashed an enemy offensive and before the enemy starts a new offensive, he is on the strategic defensive and we are on the strategic offensive. At such times, our operational policy is not to attack enemy forces, which are entrenched in defensive positions in which we are not sure of defeating, but systematically to destroy or drive out the small enemy units and puppet forces in certain areas, which our guerrilla units are strong enough to deal with, and to expand our areas, arouse the masses for struggle against Japan, replenish and train our troops, and organize new guerrilla units. If the enemy still remains on the defensive when these tasks are underway, we can expand our new areas still further and attack weakly garrisoned cities and communication lines and hold them for as long as circumstances permit. These are all tasks of the strategic offensive. And the purpose is to take advantage of the fact that the enemy is on the defensive so that we may effectively build up our own military and mass strength, effectively reduce the enemy's strength, and prepare to smash the enemy methodically and vigorously when he mounts an offensive again. It is essential to rest and train our troops, and the best time for doing so is when the enemy is on the defensive. It is not a question of shutting ourselves off from everything else for rest and training, but of finding time for rest and training while expanding our areas, mobbing up small enemy units, and arousing the people. This is usually also the time for tackling the difficult problem of getting food supplies, bedding, clothing, etc. It is also the time for destroying the enemy's communication lines on a large scale, hampering his transport, and giving direct support to the regular forces in their campaigns. At such times, the guerrilla base areas, guerrilla zones, and guerrilla units are in high spirits, and the areas devastated by the enemy are gradually rehabilitated and revived. The people in the enemy-occupied territories are also delighted, and the fame of the guerrillas resounds everywhere. On the other hand, in the camp of the enemy and his running dogs, the traitors, panic, and disintegration are mounting. While there is growing hatred of the guerrillas and their base areas, and preparations to deal with them are intensified, during the strategic offensive, therefore, it is impermissible for the guerrilla commanders to become so elated as to underrate the enemy and forget to strengthen unity in their own ranks and to consolidate their base areas and their forces. At such times, they must skillfully watch the enemy's every move for signs of any new offensive against us, so that the moment it comes, they can wind up their strategic offensive in good order, turn to the strategic defensive, and thereby smash the enemy's offensive. Chapter 8. Development of guerrilla war into mobile war. The fifth problem of strategy in guerrilla war against Japan is its development into mobile war, a development which is necessary and possible because the war is protracted and ruthless. If China could speedily defeat the Japanese invaders and recover her lost territories, and if the war were neither protracted nor ruthless, this would not be necessary, but as on the contrary the war is protracted and ruthless, guerrilla warfare cannot adapt itself to such a war except by developing into mobile warfare. Since the war is protracted and ruthless, it is possible for the guerrilla units to undergo the necessary steeling and gradually to transform themselves into regular forces so that their mode of operations is gradually regularized and guerrilla warfare develops into mobile warfare. The necessity and possibility of this development must be clearly recognized by the guerrilla commanders if they are to persist in and systematically carry out the policy of turning guerrilla warfare into mobile warfare. In many places, such as the Wutai Mountain region, the present guerrilla warfare owes its growth to the strong detachments sent there by the regular forces. The operations there, though generally of a guerrilla character, have contained an element of mobile warfare from the very beginning. This element will gradually increase as the war goes on. Herein lies the advantage which makes possible the swift expansion of the present anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare and its rapid development to a higher level. Thus, the conditions for guerrilla warfare are far superior to what they were in the 3 northeastern provinces. To transform guerrilla units waging guerrilla warfare into regular forces waging mobile warfare, 2 conditions are necessary: an increase in numbers and an improvement in quality. Apart from directly mobilizing the people to join the forces, increased numbers can be attained by amalgamating small units, while better quality depends on steeling the fighters and improving their weapons in the course of the war. In amalgamating small units, we must on the one hand guard against localism, whereby attention is concentrated exclusively on local interests and centralization is impeded, and on the other, guard against the purely military approach whereby local interests are brushed aside. Localism exists among the local guerrilla units and local governments, which are frequently preoccupied with local considerations to the neglect of the general interest, or which prefer to act each on its own because they are unaccustomed to acting in larger groups. The commanders of the main guerrilla units or of the guerrilla formations must take this into account and adopt the method of gradual amalgamation of part of the local units, allowing the localities to keep some of their forces and expand their guerrilla warfare. The commanders should draw these units into joint operations and then bring about their amalgamation without breaking up their original organization or reshuffling their cadres, so that the small groups may integrate smoothly into the larger group. As against localism, the purely military approach represents the wrong viewpoint held in the main forces by those who are bent on expanding their own strength and who neglect to assist the local armed units. They do not realize that the development of guerrilla warfare into mobile warfare means not the abandonment of guerrilla warfare, but the gradual formation in the midst of widespread guerrilla warfare of a main force capable of conducting mobile warfare, a force around which there must still be numerous guerrilla units carrying on extensive guerrilla operations. These guerrilla units are powerful auxiliaries to the main force and serve as inexhaustible reserves for its continuous growth. Therefore, if a commander of a main force has made the mistake of neglecting the interests of the local population and the local government as a result of a purely military approach, he must correct it in order that the expansion of the main force and the multiplication of the local armed units may both receive due attention. To raise the quality of the guerrilla units, it is imperative to raise their political and organizational level and improve their equipment, military techniques, tactics, and discipline so that they gradually pattern themselves on the regular forces and shed their guerrilla ways. Politically, it is imperative to get both the commanders and the fighters to realize the necessity of raising the guerrilla units to the level of the regular forces, to encourage them to strive towards this end, and to guarantee its attainment by means of political work. Organizationally, it is imperative gradually to fulfill all the requirements of a regular formation in the following respects: military and political organs, staff and working methods, a regular supply system, a medical service, etc. In the matter of equipment, it is imperative to acquire better and more varied weapons and increase the supply of the necessary communications equipment. In the matter of military technique and tactics, it is imperative to raise the guerrilla units to the level required of a regular formation. In the matter of discipline, it is imperative to raise the level so that uniform standards are observed, every order is executed without fail, and all slackness is eliminated. To accomplish all these tasks requires a prolonged effort, and it cannot be done overnight. But that is the direction in which we must develop. Only thus can a main force be built up in each guerrilla base area and mobile warfare emerge for more effective attacks on the enemy. Where detachments or cadres have been sent in by the regular forces, the goal can be achieved more easily. Hence, all the regular forces have the responsibility of helping the guerrilla units to develop into regular units. Chapter 9. The Relationship of Command. The last problem of strategy in guerrilla war against Japan concerns the relationship of command. A correct solution to this problem is one of the prerequisites for the unhampered development of guerrilla warfare. Since guerrilla units are a lower level of armed organization, characterized by dispersed operations, the methods of command in guerrilla warfare do not allow as high a degree of centralization as in regular warfare. If any attempt is made to apply the methods of command in regular warfare to guerrilla warfare, its great flexibility will inevitably be restricted and its vitality sapped. A highly centralized command is in direct contradiction to the great flexibility of guerrilla warfare and must not and cannot be applied to it. However, guerrilla warfare cannot be successfully developed without some centralized command. When extensive regular warfare and extensive guerrilla warfare are going on at the same time, their operations must be properly coordinated. Hence, the need for a command coordinating the two, i.e., for a unified strategic command by the National General Staff and the war zone commanders. In a guerrilla zone or guerrilla base areas with many guerrilla units, there are usually one or more guerrilla formations, sometimes together with regular formations, which constitute the main force. A number of other guerrilla units, big and small, which represent the supplementary force, and many armed units composed of people not withdrawn from production. The enemy forces there usually form a unified complex to concert their operations against the guerrillas. Consequently, the problem arises of setting up a unified or centralized command in such guerrilla zones or base areas. Hence, as opposed both to absolute centralization and to absolute decentralization, the principle of command in guerrilla war should be centralized strategic command and decentralized command in campaigns and battles. Centralized strategic command includes the planning and direction of guerrilla warfare as a whole by the state, the coordination of guerrilla warfare with regular warfare in each war zone, and the unified direction of all the anti-Japanese armed forces in each guerrilla zone or base area. Here, lack of harmony, unity, and centralization is harmful, and every effort must be made to ensure all three. In general matters, that is, matters of strategy, the lower levels should report to the higher and follow their instructions so as to ensure concerted action. Centralization, however, stops at this point, and it would likewise be harmful to go beyond it and interfere with the lower levels in matters of detail like the specific dispositions for a campaign or battle. For such details must be settled in the light of specific conditions which change from time to time and from place to place, and are quite beyond the knowledge of the distant higher levels of command. This is what is meant by the principle of decentralized command in campaigns and battles. The same principle generally applies in regular operations, especially when communications are inadequate. In a word, it means guerrilla warfare waged independently and with the initiative in our hands within the framework of a unified strategy. Where a guerrilla base area constitutes a military area divided into sub-areas, each comprising several counties, each of which is again divided into districts, the relationship between the various levels from the headquarters of the military area and sub-areas down to the county and district governments is one of consecutive subordination, and every armed force must, according to its nature, be under the direct command of one of these. On the principle that has been enunciated, in the relationship of command at these levels, matters of general policy should be centralized in the higher levels while actual operations should be carried out in the light of these specific circumstances by the lower levels, which should have the right of independent action. If a higher level has something to say about the actual operations undertaken at a lower level, it can and should advance its views as instructions, but must not issue hard and fast commands. The more extensive the area, the more complex the situation, and the greater the distance between the higher and the lower levels, the more advisable it becomes to allow greater independence to the lower levels in their actual operations, and thus give those operations a character conforming more closely to the local requirements, so that the lower levels and the local personnel may develop the ability to work independently, cope with complicated situations, and successfully expand guerrilla warfare. For an armed unit or bigger formation which is engaged in a concentrated operation, the principle to be applied is one of centralization in its internal relationship of command, since the situation is clear to the higher command. But the moment this unit or formation breaks up for dispersed action, the principle of centralization in general matters and of decentralization in details should be applied, for then the specific situation cannot be clear to the higher command. Absence of centralization where it is needed means negligence by the higher levels or usurpation of authority by the lower levels, neither of which can be tolerated in the relationship between higher and lower levels, especially in the military sphere. If decentralization is not effected where it should be, that means monopolization of power by the higher levels and lack of initiative on the part of the lower levels, neither of which can be tolerated in the relationship between higher and lower levels. especially in the command of guerrilla warfare. The above principles constitute the only correct policy for solving the problem of the relationship of command. End of Problems of Strategy in Guerrilla War.